We do not have a bubble as per se the NBA, but we kind of have a mini bubble that when they're here, that it will kind of be like a bubble. The key for us is keeping the guys out of harm's way when they're not in our building. When it comes to practice, when we're on the practice field and on the game field, we're playing football, period.
Welcome back for the latest edition of Broncos Beat. I'm Alexis Perry, and joining me tonight to react to what Coach Fangio just said about some of the challenges facing him and this team as training camp ramps up, as well as a few other key statements made last week. We have James Palmer from the NFL Network, Cecil Lammey from 104.3 The Fan, and Taylor Kilgore from KKTV Colorado Springs. A big thank you to all of those in the Springs for tuning in for the very first time as we debut in the market tonight. Well, when Coach Fangio met with the media last week, he said other than some social distancing precautions, when it comes to the football field, it's pretty much going to look like business as usual this training camp. While I think we can all agree that we hope that that is the case, there's no doubt that some aspects of camp will be at least a little bit more difficult to accomplish this year in the midst of this global pandemic. So Taylor, what do you think some of the toughest challenges are facing Coach Fangio and this team during training camp?
Well, obviously, across the sports world right now, there's a lot of distractions, the world in general. I think training camp, though, it's about locking in. So I don't think that outside noise is going to bother them too much, aside from the obvious distractions of worrying about a global pandemic. But as far as on the field, during training camp, there's usually two things going on at once, right? You have your vets that you want to get ready for game time, and then you got your newbies that you're trying to find that support staff who's going to fit in, who's going to be able to help out. And usually what I would think is not having those preseason games to kind of benchmark and break up the monotonous every day on the field time. I think that's going to be huge for everyone, and especially for those new players, those young guys, the rookies, first year, second years, not having that time under the lights to really show what they can do. I mean, the reality is in practice, you're not tackling to the ground. It's not live action. So I think that's going to be your biggest, hurdle during training camp this year.
Well, I want to piggyback off what Taylor said and said it's the preseason that you're missing out on, which the games don't count, but they definitely do matter. And it's to find those undrafted and late round gems like the Broncos do, every single year. For me, it's also missing out on joint practices. James, you can tell me if this is going to become more of the league norm. I was hoping that it would be, because in a joint practice, you actually can learn a little bit more, even though there's no live tackling. You're going a situation by situation. You're telling the other team, this is the look we want. This is what we're going to run. You've got the natural competitiveness. Usually we see some fisticuffs in a day or two of these joint practices, but it's missing out on that interaction with other teams that I think will be difficult and the most challenging this preseason.
Yeah, Cecil, the thing that jumps out at me is DJ Swearinger picking off Peyton Manning and just taking it to the house in celebration, and just things erupt between the Texans and the Broncos, if you remember that a couple of years back. I do have to be realistic about this, and if Vic Fangio says that everything is going to be status quo when practice comes around, I think he's being naive. I mean, the more people I talk to around the league is nothing is normal. Look at what just happened in Philadelphia with their head coach, Doug Peterson, testing positive. Doug has had things in place after talking to him, a backup plan for every possible scenario that could be out there. I hope Vic Fangio has that. And the more teams I talk to, it's this. The more continuity within your building, the more experience your head coach has, and the better spot you will be in moving forward, because every team's going to have something that they're going to have to deal with. I want to see when something happens that's not normal in this building, how does Vic Fangio have a plan for that, and how does he handle it?
Like Taylor said, no preseason games. That's obviously a huge thing going into this training camp. But someone we really wouldn't have seen much of this preseason anyways, the wily old vet, Von Miller, who, according to Coach Fangio, seems primed for a big season.
From everything I hear and know, I do think he's had a hell of an off season. I'm anxious to see him. He's put on some weight. I know he's worked extremely hard. And I do sense that he's got a hunger to his game and to his attitude that I don't think he's had the last few years.
Well, Von Miller, he is entering his 10th season in the league. And with this hunger in his attitude and in his game, do you guys think there's a chance that we are about to see the best version of Von Miller since, maybe Super Bowl 50?
Absolutely. I'm just going to jump in, guys. Hope you
Yeah,
don't
go
mind.
for it, girl.
Yeah, I think, he's coming off his lowest sack total in 5 years or something like that. I mean, I think he is very hungry, not to mention Vaughn's a guy that wants to win. And this team has been starving for that these last few years. So yeah, I think motivation's at an all-time high right now for Vaughn.
I think the relationship between Von Miller and Vic Fangio has been a work in progress. When Vic Fangio says he's got an attitude like we haven't seen in the last few years, it was a bit shocking to me. I've been around Von Miller since he came into the league in 2011. He's always had an excellent attitude. So if it's better than ever, then you should expect it to be better than ever. But the role that he plays, please don't drop into a coverage. Please don't have him, trying to be open in space and trying to find a running back out of the backfield. Let him rush the passer. And even though his sack total was low, as I've often said, he led the league in incompletions and interceptions caused by his pressure. With Bradley Chubb back, we could see a rejuvenated Von Miller.
I think that was one of the biggest things, Cecil. With no Bradley Chubb on the opposite side, I don't think if people really studied the film closely enough to see how much attention Von Miller was getting and how much of a struggle it was to not only get after the quarterback, but to be an impactful player in the run game as well. And he was. And he had a lot of extra attention because there was no Bradley Chubb on the other side. But I think us being in that locker room towards the end of the year, you kind of saw Vaughn prepping for what this offseason was going to be about. He was pretty open about, I'm going to go back to some of the trainers I've used in years past. I'm going to go back to some of that unconventional workouts that I've used in years past. He was almost chomping at the bit for the season to be over so he could start prepping for this year. And I think Vic Fangio and the relationship with him that you brought up is important because he came in here last year as a first-year head coach, I think, riding Von Miller pretty hard in what he expected of him. And he wasn't shy about saying that more could come out of Von Miller, and he's been pushing him. One of the best defensive minds in football, looking to get more out of one of the best defensive players in football. I think we are going to see it because that motivation's there contract-wise, age-wise, and just the disrespect he feels he has faced from around the league, Alexis, that he needs to prove that he's back in that elite pass rusher, one of the best 2-3 guys in the league.
Well, he is playing for his team option this year, which would guarantee him $7 million in 2021. What do you guys think John Elway, Coach Fangio, and the rest of that front office needs to see from him this year in order to pick that up? James?
I'll start off with, it is going to be a difficult situation because very rarely do you have a defensive player be the face of your franchise. And that's what Von Miller is. He's the face of the Denver Broncos franchise. And difficult decisions at times have to be made. The organization you always look at when this type of scenario comes up is the New England Patriots. At one point, they were going to cut Tom Brady. They didn't know when that was going to be, but Tom ended up doing something on his own prior to them doing that. But the reason I bring that up is that's the greatest relationship we've seen in the NFL, right? Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. But they were always going to rip that Band-Aid when it was time. There's a lot of money, Cecil, that needs to be spent over the next couple of years with all these second-round picks that are coming up for paydays in the next several years. You're going to have to plan financially if another contract for Von Miller, when you're going to have to pay Bradley Chubb as well, is going to fit into the cards and how that all plays out.
Well, this is a win-win situation because if Von Miller does play out of his mind and the Broncos decide not to pick up his option, he's going to get a big money deal. And if the Broncos do pick up his option, look at the numbers that Joey Bosa's getting. Like, that's actually a bargain price, which you could, it's rare to believe, but in 2016 when he signed that deal, what a big deal. Yeah, now the market has changed. So Von Miller is actually a pretty good price if he plays well and the team picks up his option for 2021.